Hello, and welcome to Archives and Records Simplified. These videos are aimed at people looking for basic knowledge about archives and records management, although at times I will also touch slightly on information and library science. These videos are designed to provide bite-sized chunks, which means that almost every video will be less than 15 minutes. These videos are honestly for everyone, and comments and suggestions are always more than welcome. About me, Sean McMillan, I'm an archivist based in London, and you can learn more about me via my LinkedIn profile, to which there is a link posted below. And I'll also post a transcript and notes also if you struggle at any point to understand my accent. And lastly, if you enjoy these videos, I would be extremely grateful if you could kindly like, subscribe and share. Thanks again.
Okay, so MPLP. MPLP stands for More Product, Less Process, and the term comes from an article written by Mark A. Green and Dennis Meisner in 2005 that was about a more sustainable approach to archival cataloguing. It's been quite influential and it's been adopted by various institutions in the last 15 years, and I'm going to go over what MPLP is in this presentation. I should say that this isn't a substitute for actually reading the article, which I'll post in a reference at the end. Okay, so the article is very much a call to action, and in the early sections of the article, Green and Meisner really sort of set the context for which their research and their recommendations take place. Green and Meisner indicate that modern approaches to archival cataloguing are really not working. They indicate that growing uncatalogued collections is a problem for the profession, especially, I guess, in terms of reputation, and they base this research on quite an extensive literature by studying NHPRC grants, undertaking I think 2 main surveys and looking at other similar studies. And they also indicate that, largely speaking, 2 options exist. Either archival institutions seek significantly more funds in order to undertake the quality of cataloguing that they previously intended to do, or they look to streamline their options and look for a more efficient way at cataloguing collections and making them accessible. And I would say their article probably looks more closely at that second option. Okay, the other thing Green and Meisner did was they set a set of guidelines that underpins the article. These guidelines are that they want to they wanted to enhance the availability of collections to users. They wanted to assure adequate arrangement of materials for user needs, and they also talk about taking the minimum steps necessary for physically preserving the collection of materials. So this is a sort of minimalist approach. And it should be noted that they wanted to describe materials sufficiently for use. So one thing I would say about the article quite generally is it does seem to have a very user focus. It's a very user-focused article, and it's really about making collections as accessible as possible. And one of the other key themes is sort of minimalism. This means doing the least amount of work necessary to meet an acceptable target. Okay, so some key findings from the article. They found that often was the case that item level cataloguing is rarely necessary. They noted that the archival profession is struggling to come to terms with a daunting administrative reality. In other words, just the sheer scope of what we're trying to do is often greater than what we're able to do. They noticed that backlogs are often not being addressed in various institutions. They indicate that preservation practices are not applied consistently, that not all preservation practices are essential. So for example, in the article, I think they sort of indicate that removing staples and paper clips isn't really an essential task, and that trade-offs really must be made. So in order to move forward in some areas, it might be the case that we might need to regress in others. Okay, and the Green and Meisner also indicated some principles for change. So at the start of these principles is the golden minimum, and this is the idea that we should aim to do the least amount of work needed to complete the job to an acceptable level. So the idea being is to be as efficient as possible and to essentially streamline the practices as far as possible. They also focus a lot on arrangement, and they say that we really should be focusing on the series or the subfonds level as opposed to looking into arranging individual folders and items. What's quite interesting as well, and I think this is an important point, is they also note a difference between physical and intellectual arrangement. Physically sorting a collection, as in moving boxes and moving folders around, can be very different from intellectually arranging a collection in a catalogue, and it doesn't necessarily have to be the case that a collection, the physical order of a collection should be identical to the intellectual order. In fact, for larger items or for items that have specific media requirements in terms of how you store them, it's often the case that they will be arranged differently, and I think that's important to note. They also indicated that descriptions should be as crisp and concise as possible, and I generally tend to agree with this. I often think if your descriptions are becoming longer, then you should probably consider using a scope and content note. And they also talk about preservation, about undertaking work at the macro level as opposed to the micro level. And just to be a bit clearer about what this means that rather than focusing on individual folders and removing paper clips, etc., a better idea might be to think about the institution more generally, such as the environmental settings, ensuring humidity controls, focusing on that more so than individual collections and individual folders. And in general, and the last point, maybe one of the more controversial points, just in my opinion, is in terms of access, where they argue that unprocessed collections should be presumed open to researchers. I have to say I'm a little bit unsure about that personally, but that is one of their recommendations. Okay, so some additional notes before we finish up. Overall, I would say MPLP is highly relevant, and I'm not surprised to see it's been adopted by various institutions in the UK and North America. I know for a fact that the University of Oxford have employed MPLP at times, and I believe other institutions such as the University of Huddersfield have also. It's also worth pointing out that the article was primarily written by 2 American archivists, but I do think a lot of what they observe is relevant in the United Kingdom. There was a report titled Archives for the 21st Century in 2009 by the UK government, who also indicated various institutions have large backlogs of uncatalogued material. One of the other things they talked about was that often many institutions don't have the funding to do the things that they want to do, and they also talked about that there seems to be a greater impatience in terms of collections becoming accessible. In other words, people nowadays, maybe because of the internet or because of social media, we expect information faster than we ever did before. And again, that would indicate that the environment for the archive sector in the UK is similar to the one described by Green and Meisner in the United States. That said, there are a few general considerations I would think about. The first couple I'd say are legal. Now, to be absolutely clear, Green and Meisner don't recommend that you make sensitive materials available and not all. They indicate in the article that if a collection has very obvious legal risks, then you shouldn't make it accessible to the general public or anyone else. But they do indicate as well that unprocessed collections should be made accessible, and I personally would be a bit unsure about this. My understanding of GDPR regulation, which of course came long after this article was written, and of course it's maybe more relevant in the United Kingdom and Europe than it is in the United States. My understanding of GDPR is that it's about as much as encouraging a sort of mindset and an attitude towards private information as it is about a set of very specific steps or protocols. And on this basis, I would say that making uncatalogued collections accessible without checking them, I think would be, that would be questionable if you're following GDPR regulations and you're trying to be as responsible with data as possible. The other thing I would say is that if you are cataloguing a collection, and say it's a large collection of 400 or 500 boxes or so, and only a handful of items in the collection have anything that's sensitive about it, then by having the collection catalogued to a lower level, it means that you can restrict those items without having to restrict the entire collection. If you've only catalogued, say, to series level, I think it becomes increasingly harder to sort of isolate and localize the items which are sensitive, because you just don't have that metadata. Those items might not have specific reference codes, they might not be in marked archival folders if they've not been processed to that level. So that's just something else to think about. And I guess that the same very much goes for copyright also. In terms of digital preservation and digitization, I think with digital preservation it can be very difficult to do this accurately without identifying individual items. So for example, if you're working on a collection of 300 or 400 floppy disks, then you'll probably find that you need to process in each one of those individually in order to preserve it properly. And of course, with the case of digitisation, if you're digitising a collection, then often it will undertake creating a sort of digital surrogate for each physical item. And for that, you would often need to ensure that each physical item has some sort of reference code that can relate it to its digital clone. And just generally, one last thing I would say in this topic is I do think it's worth thinking about representation. A number of, I mean, this is probably a grey area, but what I would say is a number of institutions and a number of cataloguers are under increasing pressure to make sure that their collections are as representative as possible, and about making sure that as many voices are being represented in different collections, etc. Different stories are being represented, and I think if you only catalogue to a very high level, then sometimes you maybe do lose that detail, which in some ways can be a little bit exclusive. That said, you could also go the other way and say that if you adopt an MPLP approach and you save time in some areas, then you might be able to put that time to better use in others. As we're saying, one of the things about MPLP is that as far as I know, other institutions at times have selected which parts they want to take an MPLP approach, so they might be MPLP in regards to the preservation practices, but less so with arrangement. I don't think it's something that you have to be all in or all out for. And just generally, one thing I would say that this article and this discussion that I'm having here is all very much theoretical. If you're ever approaching a collection or you're unsure about anything to do with how accurately you should catalogue it or what materials you should sensitivity review, if you should sensitivity review them at all, I would often say that the donor agreements and any relevant grant applications would still be the first port of call, because these documents will sometimes sort of outline what your first priorities should be, and that should always come first, I would say, ahead of any theoretical considerations. Okay, so that covers it all. So I've left some references and further reading. The article itself can be accessed via the first link, and also came across a couple of really useful blogs about MPLP. So otherwise, I hope you've enjoyed this video, and if you have any comments or questions, please feel more than free to post them below. Thanks again.
And if you enjoy these videos, I would be extremely grateful if you could like, subscribe and share. And also just to remind you that I would be absolutely delighted to take any requests for future videos also.